Okay, folks, I know that some of you are needing to take a step back after what's happened with the Supreme Court this weekend, so here's what I'm going to do. This episode isn't going to mention anything about it.
You don't have to be poor anymore. Jesus is here.
The loudspeaker spoke up and said, Christianity is stupid.
Greetings, fellow worker slaves, podcasting at 128 kilobits from the Fortress of Squalitude, not far from the Redneck Mecca. This is the Atheist in the Trailer Park podcast. I'm your host, Tucker. Professor Fuzznuts is in my lap, demanding attention. Ash is sitting on one of the bookshelves in the place, giving himself a bath. Yes, it's a podcast hosted by a guy and his cats. Get over it. This is a news show episode where I cover stories in the news that are related to things like atheism, secularism, science, or I find just plain interesting. Next episode should be a chapter or two from the Apocrypha. Okay, apologies for the delay in getting the episode out, but actually it turned out to be a really good thing. And I'll get to that here in just a moment. The reason the episode is late, even though I did have a 4-day weekend, is that on Saturday, just as I was about to go to bed, I got a call from a friend of mine who I know thanks to the local Democratic Party. And she says, hey, we've got a booth at the local street festival and we need somebody to work it. Can you come? Well, now, naturally, I would like nothing better than to crawl into bed and go to sleep. However, knowing what is about to happen in D.C. at that time, and knowing that more of us who show up at the booth, the better it is, I naturally agreed. So that, threw my sleep schedule well out of whack. I slept, I think, most of Sunday. And then I I put the episode together, the script, and I was getting ready to record, and it was like, I'll just take a little nap. I woke up sometime on Monday afternoon, sort of. I didn't really sleep all that well. And as I'm laying there in bed, in that insomniac state where you're never really sure if you're Jack or Tyler Durden, I'm scrolling through Facebook, and I see a post from a guy I went to high school with. Now, I haven't seen this guy since I graduated. As a matter of fact, I think his family may have moved away before graduation, right before. I could be wrong on that. Anyways, he lives in San Francisco now. He's a lawyer. And when the Trump put his first Muslim travel ban in place, this guy, I'll call him Matt, he immediately headed to the San Francisco airport and started helping people fill out the paperwork necessary to allow them in the country. He did that pro bono, and he is very, very active in politics. Well, I see this post from him, and he says, hey, does anybody know how I can phone bank for places like Tennessee, Alabama, these various states? He goes, because I want to help turn them blue. holy shit, motherfucker. Guess who does know that some of that answers? Me. So I sent him a nice little message, said, hey, man, I'll see what I can do about hooking you up. So that's what I've done. And I got to thinking about this. After I got some sleep and everything. A lot of people are angry and upset about what happened this past week and are wanting things to do to, fight against it. Well, let's be honest. Voting alone is not going to be enough. Yes, voting is very important, but we're going to have to do more because this is an existential threat to our nation. And to that end, if you really desire to have a change, then find your local political party, get involved. Okay? So you're an introvert and you can't make phone calls or knock on doors. Not a problem. Just show up to one of their meetings. Give them moral support. Let them know that you kind of agree with them. You don't have to agree with everything, but just let them know that you agree with them. That will be a big help. Our local party is sending out postcards. You can show up and fill out postcards for people. That'll help. If you have some spare money, you can donate that money. That'll help. Or if, you find out, okay, they are at this office and they're phone banking this time of day, bring them some food. Just show up, say, here, I got you some free food. They will love you for it. If you're in, say, a blue state like California, where you know that Republicans don't have a prayer of actually winning anything, then send me a private message. I will put you in touch with the people at the Democratic Party here. They would love to have you phone bank for them. Absolutely love to have you phone bank for them. And I know that there are people out there who say, well, I sort of agree with the Democrats, but I think they're too corporatist or whatever. Well, you know how folks say, if you don't vote, you don't get to bitch about the results? Well, if you don't show up or participate in things done by the Democratic Party, I don't think you really have the right to complain if they don't agree with your views. And, I realize there are people out there who can't, they don't have the free time to go to an office, or it's too far away. They can't make the phone calls. You know what? Your local party has a Facebook group of some kind, maybe several. Find it, join it. You'll provide emotional support for the people in that group who are able to do things that you can't do. There is no excuse for you not to have some kind of involvement with the Democratic Party if that's your party of choice. 10 years ago, 15 years ago, yeah, okay, it was a lot harder, and there are plenty of reasons why you wouldn't be able to participate. Now, I don't think so. I mean, we really have a lot of opportunities that we didn't have before. Just being in a Facebook group and sharing information, or, debunking bullshit that crops up in every Facebook group is an important thing. So get involved. As for what happened with working the booth, it was, we got a lot of surprising positive reactions from folks, and we even managed to get a few people registered to vote. According to one of the guys working the booth with me, there has been a large surge in the number of people registering to vote Last month, my county had about 1,500 people registering. Shelby County, where Memphis is, so it's likely to be Democratic voters, had 10,000 people to register to vote in 1 month, in the same time period. This in a state which has one of the lowest voter turnouts in the country. That should give everyone out there some hope. Okay, that's about the most exciting bits of news I have. So let's get to the real news now.
This is a fantasy business, Reverend. You can have any truth you want.
And so can you. Isn't that why you're here?
Isn't that why you are?
From religionnews.com. Mormon Tabernacle Choir changing its name but not its tune. The Mormon Tabernacle Choir, a singing phenomenon for more than 150 years, is changing its name. The choir announced Friday, October 5th, that it is following the request of its sponsor, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, aka the Mormons. The religious body, popularly known as the Mormons, asked in August that its full name be used instead of the long-known abbreviated moniker. You know, the one that's printed on their book. Thus, the Mormon Tabernacle Choir will now be called the Tabernacle Choir at Temple Square. The choir's new name preserves the heritage of the choir's home in the tabernacle and its location on Temple Square, a place of reverence and worship, the choir announced. Less than 2 months ago, President Russell M. Nelson of the LDS Church said, "The Lord has impressed upon my mind the most importance of the name He has revealed for His church." When I was a kid, I can remember seeing the choir on TV and not really thinking anything about it. I assumed that they were just some Catholic or Protestant church and had no idea that they were from some crazy offshoot of Christianity where Jesus appeared to Native Americans after the crucifixion or any of the other things associated with Mormonism. When I found out, I was actually kind of appalled that they were allowed on TV. They seemed to be an affront to the whole Christian religion. Though, objectively, one has to wonder, if Jesus was a divine being, why would He appear to only one small group of people in the world? Why wouldn't He show up in places like the Americas, Africa, Asia, and Australia? Of course, now that I think about it, imagine, if you will, what would have happened if Jesus had appeared in some other place and started preaching to people? He'd no doubt be able to win some converts with his ideas of a happy afterlife and healing people. But I don't think the locals would be too thrilled with him when he started telling them that there really wasn't anything important about their country and that this other place that they'd never even heard of was the territory God considered sacred. And the people there were better than the ones he was talking to now. That could get a fellow killed if he wasn't careful. I suspect that the whole business with the name change, both with the main church as well as the choir, is an attempt to try and distance themselves from all the bad press that they've gotten without actually doing anything significant. You know, the press that talks about them asking kids if they masturbate. The problem is, the name Mormon is pretty ingrained in people's minds, and even if news organizations give the new name for the church or the choir, they're going to have to follow it up with the name Mormon so people know who they're talking about. So, good luck with that whole name change thing, guys. I don't think it's going to work. Of course, with the president of the Mormon Church saying that using nicknames for the church is a victory for Satan, I'm sure many people will be compelled to use names like Mormons for them for a long time to come. And I have to say that if you've ever seen the Phantasm movies, the first thing you'll think of when you see a picture of the Mormon president is, holy shit, it's the tall man. From APnews.com, third Ohio diocese to release list. Another Roman Catholic diocese in Ohio plans to make public the names of priests who have been accused of sexual abuse. The Catholic Diocese of Columbus said Wednesday it intends to release a list within the next few months that will include priests who've been credibly accused of abuse, both living or dead. The diocese says in a statement that the diocese understands it's an important step to restore confidence in the church and its clergy. The announcement comes as the Steubenville, where that famous football rape case was, diocese said this week that it will make public the names of abusive priests by the end of October. Now, I know that this might sound promising, but it wasn't until the Pennsylvania case that we found out that the church is more than willing to claim that they're being forthcoming with information when in reality, they're keeping the most sensitive stuff safely hidden away. This is most likely the diocese offering up a few sacrificial lambs in order to protect the church proper. We probably won't hear anything too spectacular coming out of these releases. One would hope that the various attorney generals will see through this and start subpoenaing the shit out of the records of the various dioceses to get to the bottom of this, but I kind of doubt it. After all, we don't want to believe that there are monsters out there, even though we know there are. I mean, for a very long time, at least as far back as I can remember, there have been jokes about Catholic priests raping kids. But it really wasn't until the expose done by the Spotlight team at the Boston Globe that we began to take the issue more seriously. From the NewYorkTimes.com. Pope orders new inquiry into abuse accusations against McCarrick. Pope Francis has ordered a deeper investigation into the accusations of sexual misconduct against Archbishop Theodore E. McCarrick, the Vatican said Saturday, including a thorough study of archival documents to determine how he climbed the church hierarchy despite allegations he had slept with seminarians and young priests. The statement came more than a month after Carlo Maria Vigano, the former Vatican ambassador to the United States, published a remarkable letter accusing the Pope of having known about and covered up the actions of Archbishop McCarrick. The Vatican statement did not explicitly address the accusations by Archbishop Vigano. Instead, the Vatican said the Pope's decision was motivated generally by the publication of the accusations against Archbishop McCarrick, who once led the Archdiocese of Washington and was a major power in the Catholic Church in the United States. The Pope, the statement said, was aware and concerned by the confusion that these accusations are causing in the conscience of the faithful. Translation of that last part: the church isn't bothered by what McCarrick's done. They're just worried that people are getting upset since they've heard about it. Remember, this is the guy who said that it's Satan causing people to speak out about being abused by priests, and that the accusations of a cover-up going on within the church are blasphemous. As for the first part, how's that old song go? We investigated ourselves and found that we did nothing wrong. Thankfully, it seems that the PR Pope has started to lose his appeal with a lot of people as these scandals have come to light. One hopes that outside groups will continue to keep pressure on the church. If they do that, then Pope Frankie's efforts to keep a lid on things isn't going to be successful. I'm reminded of what Stanley Tucci's character in Spotlight says. The church thinks in centuries. Obviously, what the church is hoping to do is to drag things out long enough so that people lose interest and the church can go back to doing what it's always done, namely ignore this stuff. The more outside groups that keep pressure on the church, the harder this will be for them to do, and the more the church tries to deny the obvious facts and obstruct investigation into what's happened, the more people will become disgusted with the church and leave. Remember, when Pope Frankie was still a cardinal, he oversaw an investigation about abusive priests in Argentina, which concluded that the victims were all making it up. No shit. And I will have a link to a news story about that in the show notes. And I'm reminded what somebody once told me about the Archbishop over their church, their Catholic church. He was known as Bishop Cherry Popper. And they were like, it does an awful lot for your faith. As in, makes it go away.
Snakes. Why did it have to be snakes?
Asps. Very dangerous. You go first.
From BBC.com, Girl 8 pulls a 1,500-year-old sword from a lake in Sweden. Saga Vanasek found the relic in the Vidostern Lake while at her family's holiday home in Jönköping County. The sword was initially reported to be 1,000 years old, but experts at the local museum now believe it may date to around 1,500 years ago. It's not every day that you step on a sword in the lake, Michael Nordstrom from the museum said. The level of the water was extremely low at the time, owing to a drought, which is probably why Saga uncovered the ancient weapon. I felt something in the water and lifted it up. Then there was a handle, and I went to tell my dad that it looked like a sword, Saga told the broadcaster Sveriges Television. Saga's father, Andy Vanasek, told the English-language website The Local he initially thought his daughter had found an unusual stick or branch in the water. Okay, there's really only one thing to say about this because I know all the news sites which have covered this have all made the same comment that Saga is now our ruler. Allow me to raise a contrarian objection to that.
Listen, strange women lying in ponds distributing swords is no basis for a system of government. Supreme executive power derives from a mandate from the masses, not from some farcical aquatic ceremony.
From Gizmodo.com. Neanderthals survived in Ice Age Europe thanks to effective healthcare. Neanderthals cared for their sick and wounded, and new research suggests that this well-documented behavior was more than just a cultural phenomenon or an expression of compassion. It really did help them survive. To endure the harsh conditions of Ice Age Europe, Neanderthals adopted several strategies, including group hunting, collaborative parenting, and food sharing. New research published in Quaternary Science Reviews is adding another trick to the Neanderthal survival guide: healthcare. We argue that rather than simply a cultural trait, healthcare can be seen as part of several adaptations which allowed Neanderthals to survive in unique environments where they lived alongside large predatory carnivores and were often dependent on large mammals as a major food source. The authors, led by Penny Spickens from the University of York, write in their new study. Moreover, healthcare may have been a significant factor in allowing Neanderthals to occupy a predatory niche which might otherwise have been unavailable to them. Indeed, Neanderthals made Ice Age Europe their home for hundreds of thousands of years, so they obviously did something right. It's easy to get hung up on their extinction, a process that started about 40,000 years ago, but there's so much more to Neanderthals than their demise. Their story is one of survival. Now, our ability to know exactly what the Neanderthals might have done is limited due to the fact that all we have to go by are bones and physical objects. So we don't know how they would have treated someone who had a particularly nasty cut. but we can tell from the bones that they did take care of people who had broken them, or had diseases like arthritis, and didn't simply leave them to die. The article also points out that there would have had to have been members of the groups who functioned like midwives who could have performed things like cesareans, since the pelvis of Neanderthals, like that of humans, is actually better designed for giving birth to a much smaller baby than what women tend to do. I read somewhere years ago that if babies were the size of chimpanzee newborns, birth would actually be rather painless for women. The reason humans didn't evolve larger pelvic regions to accommodate bigger babies is because we were very good with tools. As this article points out, we have evidence showing humans practicing medicine as far back as 1.6 million years ago. That would have been our Homo erectus ancestors who were doing this. They would have been the ones who figured out that making cuts on the vagina during a difficult birth would have reduced the chances of either the mother or child dying. They also would have figured out how to stitch the mother up afterwards so that she could lead a normal life. This would reduce the evolutionary pressure for women with a larger pelvis to become the norm. Jared Lanier, the guy who coined the term virtual reality, wrote a fascinating piece on the subject about 12 years ago. I'll have a link to it in the show notes. It's definitely worth the read because he very vividly and succinctly explains the process of evolution, which brilliantly captures the path a species takes as it evolves into another one. I haven't forgotten it since I read it, and I doubt if you will either. WashingtonPost.com. This major discovery upends long-held theories about the Maya civilization. In the autumn of 1929, Anne Morrow Lindbergh and her husband Charles flew across the Yucatan Peninsula. With Charles at the controls, Anne snapped photographs of the jungles below. She wrote in her journal of Maya structures obscured by large humps of vegetation. A bright stone wall peeked through the leaves, unspeakably alone and majestic and desolate, the mark of a great civilization gone. Nearly a century later, surveyors once again took flight over the ancient Maya Empire and mapped the Guatemala forests with lasers. The 2016 survey, whose first results were published this week in the journal Science, comprises a dozen plots covering 830 square miles, an area larger than the island of Maui. It is the largest such survey of the Maya region ever. The study authors described the results as a revelation. It's like putting glasses on when your eyesight is blurry, said study author Mary Jane Acuna, director of El Tintal Archaeological Project in Guatemala. In the past, archaeologists had argued that small, disconnected city-states dotted the Maya lowlands, though that conception is falling out of favor. This study shows that the Maya could extensively exploit and manipulate their environment and geography, Acuna said. Maya agriculture sustained large populations, who in turn forged relationships across the region. Combing through the scans, Acuna and her colleagues, an international 18-strong scientific team, tallied 61,480 structures. These included 60 miles of causeways, roads, and canals that connected cities, large maize farms, aka corn, for those of you in America who don't know what maize is, houses large and small, and surprisingly, defensive fortifications that suggest the Maya came under attack from the west of Central America. One archaeologist described the discovery as being in the "oh shit" territory. That's a direct quote. Even more amazing, when researchers explored just a small part of the area that had been mapped from space, they discovered that there was far more than the satellite imagery had been able to reveal. There's an easy 100 years worth of work excavating in the area.
Maybe it's a little early. Maybe the time is not quite yet. But those other worlds, promising untold opportunities, beckon. Silently, they orbit the sun, waiting.
From Space.com, incredibly weird microbes found deep underground could change search for life on Mars. Life on Earth just got weirder, and that may have intriguing implications for life beyond this planet. That's one takeaway from new research that identified cyanobacteria, a class of microbes known for turning sunlight into sugar, living deep below the Earth's surface, far away from any ray of sunlight. Because they're so tiny, cyanobacteria don't always get much love. But they're what turned Earth from an inhospitable rock, to us anyway, into a green, glowing world and first put the oxygen we rely on into the atmosphere. What the cyanobacteria have invented has been brilliantly important through the history of life on Earth. Lynn Rothschild, an astrobiologist at NASA's Ames Research Center in California, not involved in the new research, told Space.com. They were able to turn our Earth into a place that is habitable for the animals that evolved here, Rothschild said. She called cyanobacteria one-stop shopping for turning what was easily accessible about 2.7 billion years ago in the early days of the Earth, compounds like water and carbon dioxide, into oxygen and sugar that animals need to survive. Some cyanobacteria can even turn the nitrogen that makes up most of our atmosphere into biologically useful ammonia. All of that relies on the bacteria getting enough sunlight to conduct photosynthesis, the reaction that allows cyanobacteria, plants, and similar organisms to feed themselves. So deep within the surface of the Earth is an unlikely hideout for cyanobacteria. But that's what the authors of the new research say they found. Cyanobacteria living 2,000 feet, 600 meters, for those of you in the civilized parts of the world, deep below the surface of a region called the Iberian Pyrite Belt in southwest Spain. If the new research holds up, it suggests that some cyanobacteria found themselves unable to gather enough sunlight to complete photosynthesis, then threw in the towel and figured out how to feed themselves on hydrogen instead. Hydrogen also fuels microbes found at the ocean bottom near deep-sea hydrothermal vents, which are also studied as potential analogs of extraterrestrial life. Now, let me give my inexpert opinion on this. While I think that this discovery could provide important clues about extraterrestrial life, I think it also pretty much kills the idea that there's any kind of life on Mars. Why? Well, because in order for life to survive on a planet, it has to be diverse. The reason being that if it's all identical, it's pretty easy for an event like an asteroid strike or disease to wipe it all out. If it's diverse, then maybe the dinosaurs all get wiped out, but the mammals survive. And as Darwin has said, life expands to exploit unoccupied niches. So if there was life underground, something on Mars would have evolved by this point to take advantage of the lower levels of competition for resources found on the surface of the planet. The arguments against that are the lack of protection against UV radiation and cosmic rays. Mars doesn't really have an ozone layer, so the planet gets a pretty lethal dose of UV radiation, and without a magnetic field of any consequence, cosmic rays bombard the surface at levels high enough to induce cancer. Those seem like pretty damning arguments against the possibility of life ever forming, or at least occupying the surface of Mars. Yet they aren't as clear-cut as they might seem. They do if you're the kind of person who thinks that it's impossible for us to make any predictions about what life might be like elsewhere because it should be possible for life to take an infinite number of forms. For starters, we know that life can involve ways to deal with UV radiation. On Earth, it's called fur and feathers. Back when it looked like the ozone layer was going to be destroyed by our use of CFCs, people would use the increase in skin cancers in animals as proof that this was happening. The sites of those cancers, however, were all in areas where the skin of the animals were exposed. For example, the nose on dogs. The parts of animals covered in fur didn't see an increase because the UV radiation was blocked by the fur. As for the cosmic radiation, while we don't know of any species which can block it out, other than, say, maybe tardigrades, we do know that it doesn't take much rock to shield life from it. Indeed, on the moon, which gets hit with more cosmic rays than the surface of Mars, NASA has calculated that it would take only a few feet, less than a meter for those of you in the civilized parts of the world, of lunar material covering a lunar base to protect the inhabitants from cosmic rays. So while it might not be possible for animal life to evolve protection against cosmic rays such that it can go about the surface of Mars during the daylight hours, it absolutely should be possible for nocturnal creatures to evolve and lurk about the surface of Mars. And let me add that based on research done as part of the Atoms for Peace projects done in the 1950s and 60s, as well as in the wake of the Chernobyl and Fukushima disasters, radiation tends not to significantly bother plants. I'll have a link in the show notes to a podcast which talks about the Atoms for Peace projects regarding plants in detail. But a thumbnail sketch of the research is this. After World War II, governments got the idea that since radiation could cause mutations, exposing plants to high levels of radiation could yield new food crops. Think of it as trying to do genetic engineering with dynamite, while something like CRISPR is doing it with a scalpel. Despite being exposed to high levels of radiation in the experiments, or as a result of nuclear accidents, it was impossible to completely kill all the plants. Now, many did die, and lots of them developed tumors, so it's not like they were immune to the radiation, but total sterilization of the environment seems impossible. So, to me, it seems likely that plants should be able to survive on Mars, even if they'd look like nothing we'd find here on Earth. Yet we don't see them. That indicates to me that there's no life at all on Mars, because the surface is barren, and to anything that could survive on the surface, it would be an incredibly resource-rich environment with little competition. Were life there, then anything which could take advantage of those resources, even just during the Martian night, would have an incredible advantage over anything living underground, and they would certainly leave things that we could spot with our rovers running around on the planet. From Space.com, Hubble Space Telescope apparently in safe mode after gyroscope failure. NASA's iconic Hubble Space Telescope is out of action for the time being. Hubble, which has been observing the heavens since 1990, went into protective safe mode after another one of its orientation-maintaining gyroscopes failed, mission team members said Sunday night, October 7th. It's true, very stressful weekend. Right now, HST is in safe mode while we figure out what to do. Another gyro failed. First step is to try to bring back the last gyro, which had been off and is being problematic. Rachel Olston, Hubble's deputy mission head at the Space Telescope Science Institute in Baltimore, said via Twitter Sunday, in response to tweeted questions and comments about the gyroscope's rumored failure. Hubble has 6 gyroscopes, all of which were replaced by spacewalking astronauts during a servicing mission in May 2009. The telescope needs 3 working gyroscopes to ensure optimal efficiency, mission team members have written, and the failure brings that number down to 2, if the problematic one that had been cut off can't be brought back online. While not good, don't break out the bagpipes and start playing Amazing Grace just yet. 5 years ago, the planet hunting telescope Kepler had 3 of its 4 gyros go out, and NASA was able to keep it functioning. It may be at an end soon, but that's because it's ran out of fuel, not that it lacks gyros. So even if NASA can't get Hubble's gyros up and working again, they can still get an awful lot of science out of it for some time to come. Still, if it turns out that there's nothing we can do but watch Hubble burn up in the atmosphere in a couple of months from now, the fact that it's been giving us almost 30 years worth of data means we got a really good return on our investment.
That was the most offensive science report I've ever heard. How could you do such a thing?
Beavis helped me.
From NewYorkTimes.com, Deep in Human DNA, a gift from the Neanderthals. Long ago, Neanderthals probably infected modern humans with viruses, perhaps even an ancient form of HIV. But our extinct relatives also gave us genetic defenses. People of Asian and European descent, almost anyone with origins outside of Africa, people of Asian and European descent, almost anyone with origins outside of Africa, have inherited a sliver of DNA from some unusual ancestors, the Neanderthals. These genes are the result of repeated interbreeding long ago between Neanderthals and modern humans. But why are those genes still there 40,000 years after Neanderthals became extinct? And allow me to interject something. When it was figured out a few years back that humans and Neanderthals had interbred, it was, as you'll recall from this podcast, stated, well, we don't really think that there were a lot of individuals involved in this. And I said, no, that's kind of bullshit, because the majority of the time, the sex would not, between a human and a Neanderthal, would not have resulted in offspring. So there had to be a lot of humans and a lot of Neanderthals doing the bump and grind, baby. And that phrasing in this article seems to indicate that scientists are starting to come around to the idea that, yep, humans and Neanderthals fucked a lot. Honestly, I think that, and I've said this before, I think that, Neanderthal women kind of would have been appealing to, and human women, really. But Neanderthal women would have been appealing to human men, and human women would have been appealing to Neanderthal men, because, you can boink all you want and you almost never get a baby, which means you don't have to feed another fucking mouth. That's kind of what everybody wants. Right? You want to boink as much as you can and not necessarily have a lot of kids. So a Neanderthal, if you're a human, or a human, if you're a Neanderthal, would have been a pretty good mate for that. And it raises the question in my mind, how studies have shown that if you enable women to control their reproduction, i.e., allowing them to be on birth control of some form or another, that, the civilization which they're in advances. Maybe it's what boosted us out of the Stone Age, was having all these Neanderthals mates. I don't know. Just rampant speculation on the fly for me. Anyways, back to the article. As it turns out, some of them may protect humans against infections. In a study published on Thursday, scientists reported new evidence that modern humans encountered new viruses, including some related to influenza, herpes, and HIV, as they expanded out of Africa roughly 70,000 years ago. So humans and Neanderthals overlapped for approximately 30,000 years. Yeah, there was a lot of fucking between us and the Neanderthals going on, baby. It's obvious. Some of those infections may have been picked up directly from Neanderthals. Without immunity to pathogens they had never encountered, modern humans were particularly vulnerable. Now, there's a lot that this article doesn't talk about, which is as fascinating as what it does cover. For example, there are some humans which are naturally immune to HIV. In some cases, it's a temporary immunity that can be defeated by repeated exposure to the virus. In other cases, it looks like the immunity is pretty much total. It would be interesting to see how much and which Neanderthal genes these people had, if any. Another interesting bit about the article, which I found rather surprising, is that until this study, there wasn't a listing of proteins produced by the human body which attacked at least one virus. With all the talk about data mining and so forth, you'd think that someone would have put together a database of this information before now. But they didn't. To me, it seems like this information would be really useful in things like vaccine research, especially in the era of CRISPR, which gives us cheap and precise genetic engineering capabilities. I think that you'd want to be able to genetically engineer something which produces those proteins so you could give the proteins to someone infected with a virus. I also wonder if there's a database of the proteins humans produce to fight cancer cells. Again, this sounds like it'd be extremely useful in developing therapies for cancer. But I don't know. What I'm wondering about, which isn't mentioned in the article, and we may not know, is how many of those genes got into Neanderthals because of mistakes which happened when they were infected. What will happen occasionally is that instead of the virus replicating itself inside of a cell, the genetic material of the virus, or at least a portion of it, will get incorporated into the DNA or RNA of the cell. If it happens to enough cells of the infected host, they develop an immunity to the virus which can then be passed on to their descendants. It's possible that at least some of these Neanderthal genes came about in that manner. It'd be interesting to know how many and which ones. From paleofuture.gizmodo.com. Physicist who coined the God particle and sold his Nobel Prize to pay medical bills dies at 96. Leon Lederman, the former head of the Fermi National Accelerator Lab and winner of the Nobel Prize Physics in 1988, died at a nursing home in Idaho on October 3rd. He was 96. Lederman will perhaps best be remembered for coining the phrase the God particle, referring to the Higgs boson, which was theorized for decades before it was finally observed in 2012. Sadly, Lederman had to sell his Nobel Prize in 2015 to help pay for his medical care for dementia, a horrifying indictment of the American healthcare system. The United States is the only advanced, wealthy nation in the world that doesn't guarantee health care to all of its citizens. The Nobel Prize sold for $765,000 to an anonymous online buyer. It's terrible, Leon's wife, Ellen Lederman, told NBC News back in 2015 after they had to sell the Nobel Prize. It's really hard. I wish it could be different. But he's happy. He likes where he lives with cats and dogs and horses. He doesn't have any problems with anxiety, and that makes me glad that he's so content. While this is the science part of the show, you can't help but notice, as the article says, just how shitty the American healthcare system is. Here's a guy who worked for the government, so he'd have had about the best insurance you can get. He won a freaking Nobel Prize, and he still couldn't pay his medical bills. He also didn't call the Higgs boson the God particle. He called it the goddamned particle because it was so elusive. Journalists, however, wouldn't print that, so they just called it the God particle, which is a pretty stupid name. From space.com. If extra dimensions do exist, they must be really, really small. Does our universe exist in more than just 3 dimensions? Probably not on large scales, according to new research published July 23rd in the Journal of Cosmology and Astroparticle Physics. The study found that across vast distances in space, the universe likely operates in just the dimensions we experience on Earth. The results are also helping scientists better understand the puzzling nature of dark energy, the mysterious phenomenon behind the accelerating expansion of the universe. In October 2017, scientists used the Laser Interferometer Gravitational Wave Observatory, LIGO, to detect a gravitational wave produced in the collision of two neutron stars, dubbed GW 170817. The event was also seen with traditional telescopes, allowing the scientists to simultaneously study the occurrence via gravitational waves and light waves. The dual measurements are allowing scientists to learn all sorts of things about our universe, including how many dimensions it might hold. The new results also offer additional evidence for Albert Einstein's general relativity. General relativity says gravity should be working in 3 dimensions, and the results show that that's what we see, says Chris Pardo, lead author on the study and a doctoral student at Princeton University. While general relativity has proven so far to be spot on in describing our universe, there's one thing it can't explain very well: why our universe's expansion is accelerating. Scientists nicknamed the cause for this acceleration dark energy, but no one knows what it is. Some theories modify gravity to explain the expansion, suggesting gravity works differently on large scales. Many of these ideas predict that other dimensions exist, and these could be probed by gravitational waves. The whole effort of looking for modified theories of gravity is in essence driven by the dark energy mystery. We're trying to find, is there a way that we can tweak the laws of gravity to explain why the universe's expansion is speeding up, says Tessa Baker, a cosmologist at Oxford University in England, who was not involved in the study. According to many of these theories, if extra dimensions do exist, gravitational waves would leak into those dimensions, causing the waves to weaken as they made their way across the universe. Scientists in the recent study measured how far the gravitational waves and the light waves from GW 170817 traveled to reach Earth, but the researchers didn't find any hints of the weakening that would be associated with extra dimensions. Now, it doesn't completely kill the idea of extra dimensions. They could be smaller than a mile across, or they could be larger than 80 million light years, provided that they have no characteristics which could affect things in the third dimension. It's also possible that they could be only 80 million years across, but their existence doesn't impact things in the third dimension. Personally, I don't have a clue as to which it could be. I would think that if there were other dimensions, they'd be the same size as ours. I'd also think that they wouldn't necessarily be able to interact with our own. I will point out that this is one of some recent discoveries which doesn't cause problems for string theory. I can't really talk about string theory because I've never taken the time to study it. I do know that there's been a few discoveries of late, and don't ask me which ones they are, because I don't remember, that while they don't rule out string theory, they indicate that there's problems with the theory and it'll have to be revised. Both Neil deGrasse Tyson and Lawrence Krauss have their doubts about string theory, so I think it's safe to say that the science isn't settled as of yet.
I've said it before and I'll say it again. Democracy simply doesn't work.
If we could ever get them on our side, we'd win for 1,000 years. For 1,000 years.
That, ladies and gentlemen, was the President of the United States at a rally in Minnesota this past week talking about Republicans ruling everything for 1,000 years. I don't think that I have to tell you who was the last political leader to talk about ruling for that long, and even though he doesn't deserve it, let's give the old tangerine tyrant the benefit of the doubt and say that this wasn't a deliberate reference to a certain Austrian painter we all know. This still says nothing positive about that asshole, because he's not talking about a society being ran on the principles of democracy. He's talking about domination of all people. A reasonable person would be less concerned about which political party was in power, so long as whomever was leading the country was a just leader. Because that's what's important, not whomever happens to be running the show at any given point in time. To think that it has to be a certain political party or person is to have the same mentality towards politics as one does religion. You know, lacking rational thought. I guess it can be difficult for many people to grasp that concept because we see so many folks exhibiting the same kinds of behavior when it comes to politics and religion. I'll go back again to Eric Hoffer's The True Believer and point out that this is the central thrust of his work, namely that a fanatic, be they a political one or a religious one, are identical in their actions, even though their reasons for doing so are different. And their reasons aren't all that different when you examine them closely. Both think that their belief structure, whatever it might be, is the only thing which can save the world. A world which they believe to be at risk of being destroyed if folks show anything like deference to a different perspective. And one of the reasons why they're so opposed to different ideas is because they've put so little thought into what they actually believe, while having bound their identity so tightly around a particular ideology that they're terrified they'll be intellectually annihilated if they entertain, even for a moment, the concept that they could be wrong on the subject. Allow me to illustrate this with the account of someone I know. On a message board I frequent, there was a poster who was as far right as you could go without drifting into being a Nazi. He thought Fox News was a liberal media outlet. That's how far he was to the right. But again, I will say he wasn't someone who posted racist comments or used dog whistle terms. Then suddenly he disappeared for a few months. Everybody assumed that he'd quit the board. This wasn't too terribly long after Obama was elected to power, and the political leanings of the posters on the board began to shift. Before this, many of them were Republican/Libertarian types, and after Obama won and didn't turn the country into a socialist state or cause it to immediately crater, they began drifting away, while those of us of a left-leaning bent stuck around. So we all kind of figured that he had decided to leave in order to avoid having his nose rubbed into how wrong he was. It turns out that we were mistaken. He reappeared a few months later, asked for his username to be changed to Nova, and then announced that he was transgender and was a woman. Now, those of you in the trans community, please forgive me if I've gotten it wrong as to how I should have described her transformation. I know things like dead naming are disrespectful, and I've avoided doing that, but I'm not sure if the other parts are okay, and it is pertinent to the story that her transformation be discussed. You see, while Nova had shifted her thoughts on things like gender identity, she hadn't budged an inch on her other political views. So Fox News was still a liberal outlet in her mind. Now, aside from the religious nutter types and those who think that Jordan Peterson is some kind of intellectual, everybody was welcoming to Nova. We did, however, not hesitate to give her shit when she started spouting conservative talking points, because after all, they didn't consider her to be human. At first slowly, but then rapidly accelerating, Nova's politics began to shift. She's now fully on the left side of the spectrum and is able to quickly shred any of the political bullshit that's thrown at her by those on the other side, since she knows the arguments that they're making better than they do, and she knows exactly what's wrong with them. She later said that one of the reasons why she was a right-winger was because it helped her deny who she really was, and that changing her political views was almost as hard as admitting that she was transgender. She was forced to do so, however, because those on the right never could accept her for who she was. She tried combating this by digging around in the philosophy of conservative ideals to find positions which supported the idea that she should be treated with respect and considered an equal, only to realize that it didn't matter what she might show people in her defense, they didn't care. As she pointed out, it's hard to be a conservative when you realize that a significant portion of their ideology is built around the idea of wishing you dead. It took a lot for her to admit that she was transgender, and it took a lot for her to question her political views. The process of doing both wrecked her identity of who she was, and as she has admitted, for most of her life, she was afraid to do so. Most people don't have the kind of courage that Nova had. They're scared of looking into that abyss and seeing nothing that they recognize in there. And that's why extremists of any stripe are so afraid to even entertain, just for a moment, the idea that they might be wrong about something. For them to do so is to invite the madness of the abyss. It's like the total perspective vortex from The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Most people can't face the idea that they might be wrong about their most closely held beliefs, so rather than risk ego annihilation, they don't look. It also explains why one person can leap from one fanatical belief to another, even if they're diametrically opposed to one another. Because it's not the belief system which matters, it's the desire to dominate others who are not you that is so appealing. Because if you can bend them to your will, then you do not have to question your beliefs. You create a feedback loop which justifies your every action, and you don't have to worry about having that moment where you need to admit you were wrong. And let's be clear, there's a difference between being mistaken and being wrong. Mistaken means that you are acting on bad info, even though you had good intentions. Being wrong means that you have to admit your intentions were also wrong. That's a very difficult thing to face, no matter who you are. In The True Believer, Hoffer states that there's really only two ways one can stop the fanatic. You either have to let them burn themselves out, meaning that eventually they realize the idea of propping up a failed worldview is too much trouble, and they just give up trying, or you have to hit them with a different fanatical movement, which is more effective at changing things around them. The danger of that, however, is even if this new movement is well-intentioned, it can spiral out of control and you wind up with a movement which is as despotic as something like Nazism. An example of this would be the French Revolution, which started out, let's, get rid of this king who doesn't understand, the failing economy, and wound up with, just about everybody getting their heads chopped off. This is why I've said that it's likely Michael Avenatti, Stormy Daniels' lawyer, is probably going to be the Democratic nominee for president in 2020. Unlike just about everyone else on the Democratic side of things, he's punching hard at Trump and isn't letting go. He's also not couching his language in soft terms. He's aggressively calling Trump out for who he is. If the Democrats in Congress continue in the way they have been, and if no other Democrats speak up in an equally aggressive manner, then he's going to get the nomination. And I will point out that Avenatti has just recently challenged one of the Trump kids to a cage match for charity. Yeah, that'll get him some attention and some support, even if it is not dignified. And you'll hear people during the primary say, I don't really like Avenatti, but he's really the only one willing to stand up to Trump, to tell it like it is, so I'm voting for him, even though I think that this other candidate would make a better president. Now, I will say that there is a third way in which people can be pulled out of their fanatical mindset, but it is not easy, and that's street epistemology. I know the focus on it has been aimed at religion, but as I've pointed out, the thought processes behind extreme political and religious views are identical, and the methods used to pull people out of a religious mindset can be used to pull them out of a political mindset. Again, it's not easy and it does take time, but it works, and it can help inoculate people against falling into other types of fanaticism. Now, to shift to a different type of crazy, we have this from thehill.com. Trump: Kim Jong-un and I fell in love. President Trump said he and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un fell in love while speaking at a rally for Senate candidate and State Attorney General Patrick Morrisey, Republican, surprise, in West Virginia. Trump spoke about his evolving relationship with Kim. I was really being tough, and so was he said. And we would go back and forth, and then we fell in love. No, really, he wrote me beautiful letters. In a totally not gay way, of course. I have no idea if Kim and Trump have actually been exchanging letters or not. Trump might very well be lying about the subject, but if he's telling the truth, it's really not hard, no pun intended, to figure out what's been going on. Kim's just been telling Trump that he's a big, strong, manly kind of man, and that's all it takes to get the Donald on your side. One of these days, I'm going to do an episode into why fascism and homoerotic imagery are so closely linked. If you've seen some of the kitschy fan art of Trump out there, you'll know that he's often portrayed as this figure who looks like he belongs in a Tom of Finland work. Those of you who are not familiar with Tom of Finland, don't Google it at work. Tom of Finland was the creator of pornographic gay comic books that were all filled with very muscular men sporting impossibly large cocks, porn star mustaches, and with an emphasis on bondage. The bizarre element about all of them that an artist friend of mine pointed out is that all the men looked identical to one another. I don't just mean that they were all bodybuilder types. They all had the same face. It didn't even matter what race they were. And that's really all I have to say about this, because I am in no mood to delve into things which might bring one to get even a glimpse of the concept of Trump having sex with anyone. And with that, I'm going to sign off because somebody's, it's alternating between Ash and Fuzznuts, are insisting on getting on the keyboard, and, well, this episode has crossed the hour threshold, so. Again, the next episode will be more of the Ethiopian Apocrypha, this time in a little better English.
That's it for this episode of The Atheist in the Trailer Park Podcast. You can subscribe to the show on iTunes, Stitcher, as well as just about anywhere else podcasts can be found. Many of the episodes are also on YouTube. Follow the show on Twitter. @TParkAtheist is the show's Twitter handle. It's on Facebook at facebook.com/trailerparkatheist.com. If you happen to like the podcast, please rate it on iTunes. If you'd like to support the podcast, there's a donate button on the show notes page. You can support it via Patreon at patreon.com/TNTucker. Thanks for listening.
Say goodnight, Fuzznuts.
All I know is this violates every canon of respectable broadcasting.
Damned cat.